Rain had soaked through the borrowed mantle before Caroline Müller reached the coaching yard, and the wool clung to her shoulders like wet paper while the iron handle of her wedding trunk cut into her palm. She stood among shouting ostlers, stamping horses, and wheels that sprayed filth over her hem, and she did not allow herself to stop shaking, because if she stopped she would hear the chapel bells in the distance and remember that she was meant to be travelling toward them, not away. The note remained sealed inside her glove. Her fingers were too stiff to break wax. A porter brushed past and struck the trunk with his boot, then glanced at the white ribbons tied to the lid and let out a short laugh as though he had found a joke beneath his heel. She dragged the trunk out of the wagon lane before a brewer's cart rolled over it. Mud pulled at her pinched shoes. Wet leather rubbed the skin above her heel raw with each step. She had stitched those shoes twice in candlelight, and still they bled when the weather turned. Her hands were worse. The knuckles were split from winter laundry. Soap had eaten the skin to a dull red. Cold made every crack open again. She set the trunk against a post and pressed her thumb into her palm until the pain steadied her breathing. Men in livery crossed the yard carrying valises for ladies in dry velvet cloaks. No one looked at her directly until they noticed the ribbons and the small spray of crushed winter rose pinned to her collar. Then they looked too long. The chapel carriage had waited for her at dawn outside Mrs. Voss's house. Polished black, lamps lit, 2 matched bays stamping in mist. It had been ordered for a bride. Caroline had climbed in with her trunk at her knees, and her stomach hollow as tin. And halfway down Holborn, a messenger had ridden hard, waved the coachman down, and thrust a sealed packet through the window with the Norhaven crest pressed in dark wax. The coachman had read only the direction written on the outer fold and gone pale. He had refused to continue to St. Jude's. He had turned toward the public yard without asking permission. She had not argued. There were arguments one could afford and arguments one could not. By the time they jolted beneath the yard archway, rain had begun. By the time the carriage stopped, she had learned the shape of obedience again. She broke the wax now under the lean-to eave, where drips still found her neck. The paper shook against her glove. The hand was sharp, masculine, unfamiliar in its haste. "Do not come to St. Jude's. Leave London, no explanation, no name beyond an initial and the ducal seal below it." Her stomach clenched so hard she bent over the trunk and breathed through her teeth. The words had weight. They pressed down on her shoulders more heavily than soaked wool. Around her, noise continued. Harness chains clinked. A stable boy cursed at a restless mare. Somewhere behind her a man said, not quietly enough, "Dismissed before vows. I have not seen that in years." Another answered, "Cheaper than a divorce." They laughed. She folded the page once, then twice, careful and neat, because neatness had been her only defence since childhood, and slid it back into her glove, as if the motion could make the command less public. A footman from the chapel carriage approached with his hat in both hands, rain running from his powdered wig into his collar. He would not meet her eyes. "Miss Müller, I am instructed to return the equipage immediately." She straightened, though her back ached from hauling the trunk. "You are released." "The flowers as well, miss?" She looked toward the carriage door. White ribbons drooped in the rain. The hothouse roses had already darkened at the edges. "Take them," she said. "They are paid for." He hesitated, then spoke lower. "There is still an hour before the service." "There is no service." His expression shifted. Pity fighting discipline. "Discipline won." He bowed and backed away. 2 laundresses, standing beneath the opposite awning, watched him remove the bridal ribbons from the door and toss them into a puddle where wheels ground them into grey water. Caroline did not move to pick them up. Her fingers were numb again. Her teeth had begun to knock against one another in small, precise taps she could not silence. She lifted the trunk handle and carried it to the ticket window herself, because porters required coins she did not possess in visible pockets. The clerk behind the warped glass looked first at her wet mantle, then at the trunk, then at her face. Her face always created a pause. People called her plain when they spoke about her in drawing rooms, plain and useful and lucky to be tolerated, yet strangers still stared when she forgot to lower her lashes. Large eyes were a nuisance in a woman with no protection. Dark hair escaped every pin in rain and made men assume questions she could not safely answer. She kept her gaze on the countergrain and waited. "Destination?" the clerk asked. "Northbound," she said. "Cheapest fare." He scratched a line in his ledger. "York coach, rear bench, no meal stop included, 2 shillings and 4. She untacked the inner seam of her skirt with a pin she kept hidden in her cuff. She turned slightly so the men behind her would not see. 3 silver pieces and a scatter of copper fell into her glove from the hem where she had sewn them months before, coin by coin, after Mrs. Voss began locking the pantry at dusk. She counted twice to be certain. 2 shillings and 4. 8 pence remained. The clerk took the money without comment. He pushed a stiff paper ticket through the slot and pointed with his pen toward Bay 3. "Departs in 20 minutes if the road has not washed out." "Thank you." He lifted his eyes then, and she watched him read the ribbons on her trunk. The white rose at her throat, the absence of escort. His mouth tightened. "You may wait by the brazier," he said, quieter. "No charge." Caroline nodded but did not move toward Warmth. Warmth drew notice. Notice drew questions. Questions returned her to people who had authority to answer for her. She remained in rain and opened the trunk to retie what had shifted. Inside lay the things selected for her by hands that had never touched her gently. 1 ivory gown too fine for daylight, 1 spare chemise with mended cuffs, 1 pair of gloves with the fingers already thinning, 2 handkerchiefs marked CM, and a prayer book that had belonged to her father. Mise eit pussin. Voss had sold the rest of his books by weight to a dealer on Ludgate Hill, saying shelves should not be wasted on dead men's indulgences. Caroline had watched the cart depart with Goethe and Milton, and navigation ledgers and a grammar her father had annotated in 2 languages, his careful script crossing margins like a second voice, refusing silence. She had kept only the prayer book because it fit beneath her pillow, and because Mrs. Voss had not noticed it missing. She touched the cracked leather now and felt her throat constrict. She closed the trunk quickly when a pair of boys ran past, splashing through mud. Her father had died in April with debt notices stacked like cards on his bedside table, and apology in his eyes each time he woke. He had been a gentleman who trusted contracts and weather and partners who smiled while they lied. After the funeral, Mrs. Voss wore lavender silk and spoke of practicalities. She changed locks. She dismissed the old cook. She moved Caroline to a narrow attic where frost rhymed the inside of the pane. She rationed bread by day, then by half day, then by mood. She assigned winter laundry to raw hands and called them idle when they cracked. When creditors came, she seated Caroline in the drawing room in a faded dress and described her as the remaining negotiable asset, too old to command dowry, too plain to tempt affection, suitable only for settlement. The Duke's proposal had come as paper, terms, and signatures. Mrs. Voss had smiled for the first time in months and said gratitude would become Caroline. Gratitude had tasted like iron. By the final week of February, Caroline had stopped asking what sort of husband offered marriage through attorneys, and never once appeared in person. She had stopped asking whether vows spoken as debt payment counted as vows at all. In darkness, she memorized the route from attic to washhouse, so she would not wake the household. Soon she knew which floorboards betrayed sound. Pain went into silence, and she carried trays with steady wrists while her stomach folded in on itself. Tears did not come when Mrs. Voss struck her in the passage for dropping a spoon. They did not come when one stepsister took her mother's cameo and wore it to supper, laughing that heirlooms looked better on faces men would notice. Not even this morning, when the maid who dressed her whispered, with frightened kindness, that brides should not shiver so hard before daylight. The northbound coach rolled into Bay 3 under a hiss of rain. 6 horses, mud to the axles. The guard shouted for passengers and swung down to check straps. A gentleman in a fur collar climbed aboard first and looked openly displeased when he saw Caroline's trunk. A seamstress with a bundle of patterns took the corner seat by the window and kept her eyes on her lap. 2 farmers argued over basket space. No one offered to lift Caroline's case. She bent, braced her knees, and raised it alone to the boot while the guard watched in surprise. Her shoulder burned. Her breath caught. She swallowed it and fastened the strap with fingers that barely obeyed. As she turned to climb in, one of the chapel footmen crossed the yard at a run, capless, rain streaming down his face. For a brief wild second her heart struck her ribs so hard she thought she might faint. Recall, she thought. Explanation, some correction of the morning that would return the world to shape. The man stopped an arm's length away and held out a square parcel wrapped in oilcloth. "Your veil, miss," he said. "It was left beneath the carriage seat." She stared at the parcel. Fine net and seed pearls inside. Useless now. "Keep it," she said. "I cannot." "Then burn it." His eyes widened. He lowered the parcel to the top of her trunk without another word and stepped back. The guard slammed the boot shut. Metal struck metal. The sound echoed beneath the yard arch like a hammer on a coffin lid. Caroline climbed into the coach and took the rear bench where draughts came through the frame. Her skirt was damp to the knees. Her stockings clung cold to her calves. Across from her the gentleman pretended to sleep. The seamstress studied Caroline's wet rose, then looked away quickly with the mercy of someone who understood public shame and survived by never naming it. Outside, the chapel carriage turned toward the street and disappeared into rain with empty lamps. Caroline placed her gloved hand over the note in her lap and kept it there as the driver cracked his whip. The coach lurched forward. London began to slide behind her in blurred stone and smoke, and with each jolt the last thread binding her to her father's house pulled thinner, then snapped without sound. The coach pitched over a rut and drove her shoulder into the timber wall, and the sharp pain steadied her more cleanly than breath had done. Rain rattled against the roof in hard beads. Wet wool and horse sweat filled the narrow compartment. The gentleman opposite kept his eyes shut, but his gloved fingers tapped twice against his cane each time the wheels struck deep mud, a small irritated rhythm that matched the ache in Caroline's jaw, where she had held her teeth too tight since dawn. She loosened them and tasted copper from a bitten lip. London thinned beyond the streaming glass. Brick gave way to yards, then to low sheds, then to bare fields black with standing water. She pressed her palm harder against the folded note inside her glove, as if wax and paper could still bruise. Her father had once told her, during a summer storm that shook their shutters, that commands written in haste always revealed the writer more clearly than polished promises. He had smiled when he said it, ink on his fingertips, his spectacles low on his nose, the account books open across his knees. She had believed then that books and honesty and careful sums could guard a household from ruin. She had believed a man could be diligent enough to outwork disaster. In the years before debt notices began, he had risen at dawn to inspect cargo manifests and returned smelling of salt and tar and damp rope, apologising for mud on the hall tiles, while Caroline followed him with a cloth, laughing because he always forgot his boots. He had taught her to read ledgers before she was 10, not as an ornament but as a tool. "Figures are another language," he had said, guiding her hand along a column. "When men lie, numbers often tell on them." The memory came now not as comfort, but as pressure under her ribs, because those same columns had turned against him in the final winter. Insurance unpaid after one storm, timber delayed in Hamburg ice, a partner in Bristol who vanished with letters of credit and left only a polite clerk to shrug. Her father had read each new notice by candlelight and folded it with a precision that looked like dignity until his hands began to shake. He had still kissed her brow each night and said, "Tomorrow we mend it," even when his voice had gone thin. Across from her, the seamstress cleared her throat and offered a clean square of linen without meeting Caroline's eyes. Caroline blinked and found that rainwater was no longer the only wetness on her face. "Forgive me," she said quietly, and accepted the cloth. The seamstress gave a brief nod, practical and grave, as though tears in a moving coach were common cargo and required no witness beyond a spare handkerchief. Another mile, and the road worsened. Wheels sank. Harness chains clinked under strain. The guard shouted at the lead pair, and the coach lurched free with a violence that sent the gentleman swearing beneath his breath. Caroline caught the edge of the seat and felt the skin split again across her knuckles. The sting opened the next chamber of memory, whether she wished it or not. Her own mother had died when Caroline was 8, of a fever that burned through 3 days and left the house quiet in a way no door could shut out. Her father had remarried 4 years later, and at first Mrs. Voss had arrived with sweet voice and rose water and soft hands that rested on Caroline's shoulder long enough to be seen by guests. She had called her dear child in company. She had sent sugared almonds to the schoolroom once a week. She had praised the house as if she were grateful to enter it. Only after the wedding portraits were hung did her tone change from honey to chalk. "You sit too straight," she would say at breakfast, and then, "Do not take the better jam. That is for your sisters." When Eliza and Margot were brought from Bath to live with them full time, they came trailing ribbons and entitlement, and the hierarchy became visible in objects before it was spoken aloud. New velvet for Eliza, new kid slippers for Margot. Caroline wore altered gowns from trunks that smelled of camphor. Her mother's cameo disappeared first. Her father's silver watch disappeared next. Then the carved walnut desk in the morning room, where Caroline had practiced German verbs as a child, was moved upstairs to Eliza's chamber because she required a proper writing surface for invitations. Caroline had stood in the doorway with a stack of mending while 2 footmen carried it away, and Mrs. Voss had looked over her shoulder and said, "Do not block traffic. You are forever in the path of useful people." The seamstress beside her shifted as the coach jolted and tucked her pattern bundle closer to her chest. "Are you bound for York, miss?" she asked, voice low enough not to invite the gentleman's interest. "As far as my fare allows," Caroline answered. It was true, and it was not an answer. The seamstress nodded, again, reading what should be left untouched. Outside, rain slicked the hedges silver. Inside, Caroline's stomach cramped with empty heat. Mrs. Voss had discovered quickly that hunger trained obedience faster than sermons. First, she dismissed supper to improve discipline. Then she locked the pantry and claimed theft when crumbs went missing. Caroline learned to carry a crust in her apron seam. She learned which servants might look away for 1 minute at dusk. She learned the difference between weakness and fainting, and chose weakness because fainting wasted time. By the time they passed the first toll gate beyond the city smoke, the light had gone from pewter to a dim washed white that made every face look carved from bone. The coach slowed, then halted, while the guard argued rates through rain with the gatekeeper under his hooded cape. Water ran in threads down the window frame and dropped steadily on Caroline's skirt. She did not brush it away. Damp had become a second skin in Mrs. Voss's house. Attic slates leaked each November. The wash-house floor stayed slick through March. Firewood was too expensive for her grate, but always ample in the drawing-room where Mrs. Voss entertained creditors and called Caroline down to pour tea, then dismissed her before she could hear numbers. Yet numbers reached her anyway through keyholes, through account books left open in careless triumph, through the old habit her father had given her of glancing once and retaining columns entire. 1,200 owed to Cresswell and Finch, 800 to Harbury Wharf, a rolling sum to private lenders written in darker ink, interest climbing like ivy. Mrs. Voss had not caused the first losses, but she had fed on them. She sold casks from the cellar, then plate, then parcels of leased land no one believed she had legal right to move, and each sale carried a fee paid first to an agent who happened to dine at her table. When Caroline tried to ask whether her father had approved those signatures before he died, Mrs. Voss struck her with the back of her hand so swiftly the ring cut skin at Caroline's cheekbone. "You ask as if you own this house," she said. "You own your silence." The toll gate lifted. The horses pulled forward. The compartment rocked and settled. The gentleman opened one eye and muttered that the roads were a national disgrace, then shut it again, as if weather had personally offended his rank. Caroline looked past his polished boots to her own hem, dark with mud, and thought of the day Mrs. Voss announced the ducal arrangement. It had been done in the blue drawing-room at 4 in the afternoon, sunlight clear on the ormolu clock, Eliza and Margot eating candied orange peels, while Caroline stood without being invited to sit. "His Grace of Norhaven requires a practical union," Mrs. Voss said, examining her nails. "You require placement. It is a merciful fit." Eliza laughed first. Margot followed. "A duke for Caro," Margot had said. "How charitable men become when estates are involved." Caroline had kept her face still. She had asked one question only. "Has he seen me?" Mrs. Voss's smile had gone thin and bright. "He has seen your debts." The road climbed slightly, and wind struck the coach broadside so hard the frame shuddered. A baby somewhere on the forward bench began to whimper, then settled against its mother's shawl. Caroline closed her eyes for one breath and saw her father's last week with brutal clarity. Curtains half drawn against spring glare he could no longer bear. Medicine untouched at the bedside. Debt letters stacked beneath a paperweight carved like an anchor. His voice reduced to a whisper that still tried to sound brisk for her sake. "In the top drawer," he had said, fingers searching for hers. "Title copy, insurance rider. Keep them from being altered." She had found the packet that night and hidden it beneath a loose board in the attic, wrapped in oilcloth beside 3 loose bundles of copied account slips Mrs. Voss had missed in her first purge. 2 days later, after the burial, the drawer stood empty and the packet was gone from the floorboard. Someone had searched her room while she helped receive mourners. She had never proven who, though Eliza appeared at supper wearing her mother's sapphire pin the same evening, and asked whether attic dust made one feverish. Caroline opened her eyes now and stared at her own gloved hands, small and cracked and steady despite the shaking of the carriage. The old housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, had once pressed a warm cup into her palms in the scullery and whispered, "Keep copies where pride cannot find them." Caroline had done it the next day, writing out account numbers by memory on scraps and sewing them into the lining of her trunk beneath the false bottom. She had not told a soul, not because she trusted no one, though trust had become costly, but because secrecy was the only coin she possessed that Mrs. Voss could not immediately seize. A week before the wedding, Mrs. Voss found her reading the prayer book in the passage and tore it from her hands, shaking loose a pressed violet Caroline had placed there the day her father died. "Still mourning," she said, in front of 2 visiting ladies, loud enough for both the daughters to hear. "How theatrical! She mistakes grief for character." She flung the book against the wall. The spine split. Caroline retrieved it after midnight and mended it with flour paste and thread by candle stump, each stitch a vow she could not speak aloud, that she would remember facts when others demanded silence, that she would endure humiliation without surrendering language, that if a door opened even a finger's breadth, she would step through it. The coach dropped suddenly into a washout and rose again with a groan of timber. Her shoulder hit the wall once more. Pain flashed. She welcomed it. Ahead lay miles of road and a future stripped to fare paid and 8p hidden in her hem. Yet beneath her palm the folded note crackled like kindling. And for the first time since dawn she understood that obedience had carried her out of Mrs. Voss's reach, but it had not erased what she knew. The coach gave one long shudder, then a crack split the air so sharply that every passenger jerked at once, as if struck by the same hand. Timber screamed. The left rear wheel sheared away. The carriage dropped on that side and slewed across the flooded turnpike, throwing bodies against one another, cane against knee, elbow against jaw, hatpins and curses, and a baby's thin cry, all tangled in the dark. Caroline's shoulder hit the frame. Her temple struck wood. Light flashed white behind her eyes. Water burst through the lower seam and soaked her skirts to the thigh in a single freezing rush. The guard shouted from outside, then the shout cut off in a grunt as the coach lurched again and settled at an angle that made standing a negotiation with gravity. Someone kicked the door. It jammed. The gentleman in the fur collar began to swear with frantic precision. The seamstress clutched her bundle and crossed herself once, lips moving without sound. Another thud came from beneath, heavy and wrong, followed by the high, terrified wail of a child no longer inside the carriage, not the baby at the front. A boy's voice, close, under them. Caroline did not wait for permission. She braced one hand on the bench, drove her shoulder against the warped door, and felt it give 1 inch, then 2. Mud and rain forced themselves through the gap. She pushed again until the latch tore free. Cold air knifed in. She dropped to the road, boots sinking at once to the ankle in brown water that smelled of clay and horse. Passengers spilled after her, stumbling, grabbing for purchase on the tilted side of the coach. The guard limped around the front team, shouting for everyone to clear the wheels, though one wheel now lay 20 yards back in the ditch like a broken shield. The cry came again from under the rear carriage body. Caroline splashed toward it and dropped to her knees without feeling the impact. Beneath the axle, half hidden by the torn leather splash curtain, a small boy in a blue coat was wedged between a trunk and the mud ridge, his sleeve snagged on a bent iron hook. He was not crushed. He was trapped and shaking so hard his teeth clicked. His face was streaked with filth and rain and panic. "Do not pull," she told him, voice low, and even though her own pulse hammered, "you will tear the cloth into your skin. Look at me. Breathe once." He tried, failed, tried again. Hoofbeats thundered from the south before she could reach him, many horses at speed on a road that could barely carry one safe wagon. Men shouted for room. A rider in a rain-black greatcoat reined in so hard his horse reared, forelegs cutting the wet air. He hit the ground already moving, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, his jaw set like carved stone beneath rain. 2 more mounted men fanned out behind him, cloaks snapping, boots splashing. Authority arrived with him as palpable force. "Stand back," he said. The command cut across road noise and struck every body nearby. People obeyed at once. The guard stepped away from the axle. The gentleman in fur retreated 3 paces. Even the horses tossed their heads and settled under tightened reins. Caroline did not move. She had one hand under the torn curtain and one hand on the boy's wrist, feeling his pulse race in frightened bursts. "His sleeve is caught," she said, not looking up. "The hook is bent inward. I require a knife." Boots stopped beside her. "You will come out from there." She dragged her gaze up then. Rain ran off the brim of his hat and down a face she knew from miniatures in newspapers and from whispered dread in Mrs. Voss's drawing-room, though she had never stood this close. Storm-grey eyes, mouth hard, a white scar at the edge of his left brow disappearing into wet hair. The Duke of Norhaven, Julian Ashcombe, the man whose crest had sealed the order in her glove. Recognition struck late and clean. A second collision harder than the first. Her stomach clenched. Her fingers did not release the child. "A knife, Your Grace," she repeated. His eyes sharpened on her face, then on her mantle, then lower to the white ribbons still tied to her trunk, where it leaned half submerged against the ruined coach. He went very still. One of his riders moved first, drawing a short blade and offering it hilt first. Caroline took it, slid into the mud up to her forearms, and cut the snagged sleeve in 2 quick strokes. The boy cried out once as cloth gave way, then fell against her with all his weight. She backed out, dragging him clear by inches, knees slipping, petticoat heavy with road water. When they were both free, she sat in the mud and wrapped him against her chest while he gasped. His right wrist was abraded raw where the hook had scraped through wool. Nothing worse she could see in rain and haste, but shock had taken him white around the mouth. By the first week of March, the rain had learned how to fall without pause. "Blanket," she said. The Duke's man stripped off his own cloak and handed it over. Caroline wrapped the boy and checked him again, fingers at his throat, at his ribs, at his pupils in the grey light. He whimpered and clung, then looked up at her with a face too young for this road and whispered, "I lost Toby." "Who is Toby?" "My dog." A muddy terrier shook itself free from beneath the forward bench and ran to the boy, barking once in outrage. The boy began to sob from relief. Caroline pressed her forehead briefly to his hair and closed her eyes one beat. When she opened them, the Duke was still there, rain streaming down the planes of his face, watching her hands as if each motion were evidence in a trial. "Are you injured?" he asked the child. The boy shook his head against Caroline's shoulder. The Duke's gaze shifted back to Caroline. "You were ordered to leave London." She rose slowly. The child still held against her and felt wet skirts drag at her legs like chains. "I obeyed." "You should have been in my chapel." She looked directly at him then. Mud streaked her cheek. Her hair had come loose and clung black to her throat. She felt the eyes of strangers on both of them, and hated that they could witness this too. "Your Grace dismissed me." His mouth hardened further, if that was possible. "I sent no such dismissal." The words might have mattered in another hour. On this road they arrived like another burst of rain, cold and forceful, and too late. Caroline transferred the boy to the arms of the rider with the blanket and drew the folded note from her glove. The paper was damp at the edges, but the crest remained clear. She held it out. "Then someone wrote in your hand and sealed with your ring." He took it without touching her fingers. He read once. His jaw flexed. He turned the page, read again, then held it under the brim of his hat to protect the script from rain. The nearest rider leaned in. "Your Grace?" "Not now." The Duke scanned the signature line, then the body text, then the pressure marks where the nib had bitten too deep. His gaze snapped up to her. "Who delivered this?" "A mounted messenger in Norhaven livery. He stopped the chapel carriage on Holborn." "Did you see his face?" "Only briefly. Young. Fair hair. The scar near the chin." The rider with the blanket swore under his breath. The Duke did not rebuke him. He folded the note with controlled precision and slipped it inside his greatcoat. "Who else handled it?" The coachman read the direction on the outer fold. "No one else." A pause, rain, horses blowing steam. The boy, calmer now, stroked his dog with shaking fingers. The Duke spoke to his men without looking away from Caroline. "Merrick, secure statements from the guard and coachman, names and route. Halden, send one rider to St. Jude's and one to Norhaven House. Tell Klein to lock the East office and admit no one. No one." Both men moved instantly. Caroline wiped mud from her brow with the back of her hand and left a darker streak. "If this is some examination of my obedience, it is poorly chosen." His eyes narrowed. "You think I engineered this wreck to test you." "I think men with power rarely notice what their orders do once they leave their mouths." That landed. She saw it land in the minute tightening at the corner of his left eye and in the way his hand closed once against the wet leather of his gloves. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see rain caught in his lashes. "Liar," he said softly, but the word aimed elsewhere. "You are shaking from cold and hunger. Your shoes are bleeding through at the heel. You paid for a rear bench with a hidden coin. You were not fleeing in comfort." No one had ever named her condition in public with such brutal clarity. Shame burned first, then anger, then something more dangerous because naming was also a form of seeing, and she had lived too long unseen. "Do not inventory me, Your Grace. Decide whether you mean to abandon me a second time." He held her gaze. Behind him a carriage horse stamped and tossed, impatient with standing water. Around them passengers watched while pretending not to. The social world had become a ring drawn in mud, and all of them stood inside it. "You will return with me," he said. She laughed once, without mirth. "On what grounds? Contract, convenience, curiosity." "On the grounds that a forged order bearing my seal sent my intended wife onto a wrecked road in a storm." The word wife struck harder than command. She felt it in her throat, in her pulse, in the old place where dread and hope had learned to resemble each other too closely. "I am not yet your wife." "No," he said. "You are under my protection until this is answered." Protection, another command dressed as care. She had no habit of trusting either. "Mrs. Voss will claim I absconded." "She may claim what she likes before a magistrate." The riders returned in quick splashes, reporting the road ahead washed nearly to the embankment, and no safe passage north before dark. The guard from the broken coach hovered near, hat in hands, mud up to his knees. At the Duke's request he repeated what he had seen in halting detail: messenger, seal, turn-back order, dismissal at the public yard. The coachman added his own account, pale and rigid, and confirmed the crest and urgent script. The Duke listened without interruption, each answer adding weight to a structure Caroline could not yet see but felt assembling around her. When statements were done, he turned to the guard. "These passengers will be conveyed to the Bell at Finchley at my expense. Dry rooms, Food. Medical attention if required. The guard blinked. Yes, Your Grace. To you, he said to Caroline, voice lower, there is a physician and secure lodging at Norhaven House. She looked past him toward the North Road, a line of drowned ruts fading into rain. 8 pence in her hem. A trunk strapped to a broken coach. A note forged in his name. Mrs. Voss in rosewater silk at the centre of all roads behind her. Choice narrowed to practical edges. She hated the clarity of it. The boy in the blanket reached for her sleeve. Will Toby come too? Caroline touched his hair. He will. The Duke watched the gesture and then gave the order that settled the next hours like iron dropping into water. Load Miss Muller's trunk. We turn back to London. Norhaven House. Now. Now ended the argument on the road, but it did not end the weather. Rain followed them all the way back to London, hard on the carriage roof, soft against the glass, then hard again as the wind turned through the northern lanes. Caroline sat opposite the Duke in a travelling carriage that smelled of wet leather and cold iron. The injured boy lay across the seat between them, wrapped in a blanket to his chin, one small hand fisted in the scruff of his terrier's neck, as if fear would return the instant he let go. Toby watched every jolt with bright, anxious eyes and gave a low, warning growl whenever wheels slid in mud. Caroline kept her palm on the child's brow and counted his breaths. Too fast, too shallow. Shock still held him. The cut at his wrist had clotted, but the skin around it swelled beneath the torn cuff. She glanced at the Duke once and found him already looking at the bandage she had tied from her own petticoat. His coat dripped onto the carriage floor. Mud marked one knee where he had knelt on the road. He had removed his gloves and folded them with severe care, though water still ran from his cuffs. "What is your name?" she asked the boy softly. He swallowed. "Peter Vale." "Peter, does your head hurt when you move it?" "A little." "Do you feel sick?" He nodded once. She turned to the Duke. "He must be kept warm and still. No bright light. No rough handling." "You will direct it," Julian said. No courtesy wrapped the words, no hesitation either. A command, and beneath it, a trust he did not appear to notice he had given. The carriage lurched through a deep rut. Peter whimpered and reached blindly. Caroline took his hand before he could panic. "You are safe," she said. "Your dog is beside you. You are not beneath the wheel now." Across from her, the Duke's jaw tightened at the phrase "beneath the wheel." He looked out at the rain for a long beat, then back to her. "You crawled under timber that could have shifted and crushed you." She did not raise her voice. "He was crying." "That is not an answer." "It is the only one I have." By the time they crossed the outer toll into Marylebone, dusk had thickened and the lamps along the street burned as blurred coins through rain. Norhaven House rose out of the wet dark in pale stone and black shutters, its wide front steps slick as glass, its brass knockers dimmed by weather. 2 footmen ran forward before the carriage fully halted. They stopped short when they saw who climbed down first. Not a dignitary, not a guest announced by card, but Miss Muller, with mud up her skirt and hair half fallen, carrying a servant's child in both arms, while the Duke came behind her with a dog under one arm and an expression that made 3 men forget how to breathe. "Do not stand there," Julian said to the footman. "Nursery fire, hot water, clean linens. Send for Dr. Fenwick and say I require him now." The men moved at once. Inside, the entrance hall glowed with candelabra and polished marble. Rainwater dripped from Caroline's mantle and left a trail over floor tiles no one had ever allowed her to cross in such condition. A housemaid stared at the mud on Caroline's hem, then at the boy's white face, then dropped a curtsy so quickly she nearly lost balance. "Mrs. Greaves," the Duke called. The housekeeper appeared from the corridor in dark wool, keys at her waist, her grey hair smooth beneath a plain cap. Her eyes took in the scene in one sweep and sharpened. "Your Grace, this is Peter Vale, wheel injury and shock. Miss Muller has charge until Fenwick arrives." Mrs. Greaves looked at Caroline then, full and direct, not with pity and not with curiosity, with assessment. "This way, miss." They climbed to the nursery floor where heat met them in a rush from the banked grate. The room was large, half schoolroom and half sleeping chamber, with low shelves of carved animals, a narrow bed near the fire, and curtains printed with faded ships. A second maid brought steaming water and clean cloths. Another carried a tray of broth and bread that smelled of rosemary and onion, and made Caroline's stomach twist so hard she had to grip the bedpost to hide it. "Not yet," she said. "For him first." Peter shook his head weakly. "I do not want broth." "You do not need to want it." Caroline set him on the bed and knelt to unlace his soaked boots. "You need to take 4 spoons and keep them down." She worked with brisk precision, stripping wet wool from his shoulders, drying his arms and chest, checking ribs with careful pressure while he winced and complained, then stopped complaining when she asked if he wanted Dr. Fenwick to hear that he had cried harder than Toby. The terrier, affronted, put his paws on the mattress and sneezed. At the door, Julian had not left. She felt him there the way one felt a draught from an unlatched window. She did not look until she had bound Peter's wrist in clean linen and set a folded cloth, cool and damp, across the child's brow. "His pupils are equal now," she said, to no one in particular. "That is better," the Duke answered from the threshold. "Fenwick is on his way from Bloomsbury. He sent word that roads are slow." "Then we keep him warm and quiet until he comes." Peter's lower lip trembled. "Will I die?" Caroline sat on the edge of the bed and held his gaze. "No, you are bruised and frightened and stubborn. None of those kill a boy." A small sound came from the doorway. Not laughter, a breath that almost changed shape and did not complete it. "Mrs." Greaves stepped in with a dry dress over one arm. "Miss Muller, you are wet through." "I can change when he sleeps." The housekeeper hesitated, glancing once toward the Duke. "His Grace does not permit neglect in this house." Caroline kept her tone calm. "Then he may permit me 10 minutes more." Julian crossed the room in 2 strides and set the tray on the table beside her. 5 spoons, he told Peter. The child looked alarmed. "She said 4. Then she was being merciful. 5. Peter managed the smallest smile of triumphless misery and obeyed. Caroline fed him 1 spoon at a time, waiting after each swallow. He gagged once, then held it. On the 5th, he closed his eyes and leaned against her wrist, exhausted. "Good," she murmured. "Good," Julian repeated, quieter. Mrs. Greaves led Caroline to a narrow dressing room adjoining the nursery. A maid with red hands and frightened eyes helped unfasten the mud-heavy skirts and gave her a plain wool gown from house stores, too broad in the shoulder but dry and warm. Caroline wrung rain from her hair over a basin and asked, while she pinned it back with shaking fingers, "How old is Peter?" "9, the maid whispered. "His mother keeps the still room. His father was a coachman. Fever took him in January." "Has the boy had fits before?" "No, miss." "Any chest weakness?" "None that I have seen." When Caroline returned, Peter had dozed with Toby curled against his knees, and Julian standing beside the bed, not touching either of them, one hand braced on the bedrail as if the carved oak kept him anchored. He stepped back at once when she entered, his face unreadable. "Go eat," he said, "after Fenwick examines him." "That was not a request." She met his storm-grey gaze without lowering hers. "Then I decline your order, Your Grace." Silence stretched. Rain tapped the pane. The nursery clock marked each second with thin, stubborn clicks. Julian's stare held hers, cold and intent, then slid to her hands where the knuckles were split and reddened anew. When he spoke again, the edge had altered by a fraction. "Mrs. Greaves," he said, still looking at Caroline, "bring food that can be taken one-handed." "As you wish, Your Grace." Dr. Fenwick arrived at last with wet cuffs, silver spectacles, and the impatience of a man dragged from dinner to necessity. He examined Peter thoroughly, asked sharp questions, approved the bandage, and prescribed rest, broth, and a quiet room through the night, with waking checks every hour until dawn. "Who dressed this?" he asked, lifting the linen at Peter's wrist. "I did," Caroline said. He grunted neither praise nor censure and rewrapped it. "It will do." When he had gone, the household exhaled in stages. A maid banked the nursery fire. Another brought a smaller lamp and turned its wick low. Mrs. Greaves sent up oat porridge, bread, and weak tea. Caroline ate 3 spoonfuls standing at the mantel while watching Peter breathe. She could not taste any of it. Later, when the house settled and the lower bells stopped, 2 nursery maids came in to turn down bedding. They moved quietly, but servants' whispers travelled farther at night. "His Grace has not sat in this room since," one began. The other hushed her. "Do not say it. He will be furious when he remembers she is here." Caroline set down her cup. "He remembers," she said, not unkindly. Both girls froze. One twisted her apron. "Miss, we did not mean—" "You meant fear," Caroline replied. "Fear is often accurate." The bolder maid looked toward the door, then back. "He is hard on mistakes." "He is hard on disorder," Caroline said. She adjusted Peter's blanket, where it had slipped from one shoulder. "Those are not the same." The girls exchanged a glance. "You think I defend him because I must," Caroline continued, her voice low so as not to wake the child. "I defend truth where I can find it. Today he returned for a coach he believed had left. He paid for strangers' rooms before his own men changed cloaks. He sent for a physician at once. Whatever else he is not careless with lives." Neither maid answered. One nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and took the empty tray away. She believed herself alone then, save for Peter and the dog. She moved to the chair beside the bed and opened the prayer book from her trunk, the one relic she had guarded through hunger and ridicule. The spine she had mended held, though one page still bore a faint brown mark where rain had touched old ink. She did not read aloud. She only kept a finger between the leaves and watched the rise and fall of the child's chest. Outside, wind pressed rain against the nursery windows in long slant lines. Somewhere below, a door latched. Somewhere farther down the corridor, a floorboard gave a familiar complaint beneath a heavy step that did not approach and did not depart. She told herself it was one of the footmen on watch. At the first hour past midnight, Peter stirred and groaned, pressing a hand to his temple. Caroline wet the cloth again and held it to his forehead until the tightness in his brow eased. At the second hour he woke disoriented and tried to sit. She eased him back and made him sip water. At the third he whispered for his mother. Caroline sent a maid to fetch Mrs. Vale from the still room. The woman arrived with flour on her sleeve and terror in her eyes. She stopped dead when she saw her son breathing evenly under blankets, then took Caroline's hand in both of hers and bowed over it, as if over a relic. "Do not," Caroline said, startled, pulling gently free. "Sit with him, speak softly when he wakes." Mrs. Vale sat and began to hum under her breath, a tune with no words that moved like a cradle. By the middle of the night, the rain had softened to a steady hiss. Peter's fever threatened only once, a sudden flare of heat that brought tears to his closed eyes. Caroline stripped the extra blanket, cooled his wrists and neck, and waited through 10 long minutes until his skin cooled again. Mrs. Vale watched each movement and copied them. Toby never left the bedside. Near 4, Mrs. Greaves returned with a shawl and draped it around Caroline's shoulders, without comment. Her lined face softened by a degree when she saw the boy sleeping easier. "You should rest, miss," she said, "in a little while." "You have said that for 5 hours." Caroline rubbed at the ache beneath her sternum. "Then I shall say it once more." Mrs. Greaves stood beside her at the bed and studied Peter. "He will remember who pulled him out." "I would rather he remembered nothing of the road." "That is not how memory behaves." Caroline gave a faint shake of her head. "No, it is not." The housekeeper's gaze dropped to the prayer book in Caroline's lap. "Your father taught you your letters well." The sentence startled her more than praise would have done. "You knew him?" "By reputation, honest accounts, prompt wages, soft spot for strays." Mrs. Greaves looked toward the sleeping dog, then back. "This house keeps records too, longer than people think." Before Caroline could answer, a movement in the doorway caught Mrs. Greaves's eye. The housekeeper straightened and lowered her chin in respect. Caroline turned. Julian stood just beyond the spill of lamplight, one shoulder against the jamb. Coat removed now, shirt sleeves rolled, cravat loosened as if he had forgotten it for hours. His face was drawn with fatigue and something harder to name. He had heard enough to know exactly what had been said in the room. He gave no sign of having arrived, no apology for listening unseen. He simply watched Caroline's hand where it rested lightly over Peter's blanket, then lifted his gaze to hers. Mrs. Greaves withdrew soundlessly, drawing Mrs. Vale and the maid with her. The door remained open a hand's width. Rain whispered at the panes. The nursery clock ticked. Caroline rose, the shawl slipping from one shoulder. "Your Grace, the fever has broken for now. He must be woken again at dawn." Julian did not answer at once. He crossed to the bed, looked down at Peter, then at Toby, then back to Caroline. His voice, when it came, was low and stripped of every public edge. "You told them I was not careless with lives." She felt heat rise in her face despite the hour and the cold. "I told them what I saw." He held her gaze for a long moment, as if testing whether honesty could be trusted when offered, without strategy. Then, very slowly, he nodded once and took the chair beside the bed. "Wake me if his breathing changes," he said. Caroline looked at him, at the rigid line of his shoulders, at the hand he set on the bed rail exactly where it had been earlier, and understood he meant to remain there until morning, whether he slept or not. She sat down on the opposite side of the bed and folded her hands to keep them from trembling. The nursery settled around them with the strained quiet of a house listening at its own walls. Peter slept on his side, mouth parted, one hand still buried in Toby's rough fur. The terrier's ears twitched at each gust against the window, then flattened again when no threat entered. Julian sat upright in the chair, forearm braced along the bed rail, his profile turned toward the child. Candlelight cut a hard line over his brow and left the scar near his temple in shadow. Caroline folded and unfolded the corner of her shawl in her lap until she forced her fingers to stillness. She told herself to watch the boy. She watched the Duke instead. He did not shift, not once. Hours on the road had left mud at the edge of his cuff and a dark smear near his sleeve seam, yet he seemed carved into place, as if movement might break a brittle truce he had not named. His breathing was even, though shallow. Each time Peter stirred, Julian's hand tightened on the rail before the child fully woke. Each time Peter settled, that hand released by degrees. Caroline noticed because she had spent years reading danger in other people's hands. At length she said very quietly, "You should sleep, Your Grace. I can wake you at dawn." His gaze remained on Peter. "I heard that instruction already." "From Dr. Fenwick?" "From you." The reply should have sounded dry. It did not. It held a restraint that made her throat tighten for no reason she wished to examine. She pressed the prayer book flatter against her knee. "Then you heard correctly." He turned his head and looked at her directly. "You command a room as if you were born to it." "No one has ever mistaken me for born to command." "I did not say others noticed." The sentence landed between them with disturbing precision. Caroline felt heat climb her neck. She had learned to survive by being unremarkable in company, useful in private, silent under insult. To be observed at all had usually preceded harm. Yet nothing in his expression resembled mockery. It was worse. It was exact. "What else have you noticed, Your Grace?" she asked, before caution could stop her. His eyes dropped to her hands. "You hide pain in your left shoulder by turning pages with your right. You have not put your full weight on your right heel since the coaching yard. You count the boys' breaths in sets of 12. She didn't speak. "You mouth the numbers in German when you are afraid," he added. Her pulse stuttered. She had not realized she had done it loud enough to be seen. Her father's counting cadence had returned under stress since childhood, old syllables against panic. She closed her fingers over the prayer book until the cracked leather creaked. "Who taught you that language?" he asked. "My father." "Your father taught you accounts as well." It was not phrased as a question. She gave him nothing at first. The house breathed around them. Somewhere below, a coal shifted in a grate with a small, collapsing sigh. "Yes," she said at last. His gaze held hers another heartbeat, then moved back to Peter. "Good." No praise had ever unsettled her more. By the time the nursery clock marked 5, the rain had thinned to a fine, persistent mist that silvered the panes instead of striking them. Mrs. Vale returned once to touch her son's brow and whisper gratitude in a voice so raw it seemed to abrade the air. Julian inclined his head to her and said only, "He remains here." Mrs. Vale looked as though she might kneel. Caroline caught her hand and squeezed once, firm enough to keep her upright. The woman nodded, wiped her face, and withdrew. Peter woke for the dawn check, swallowed water without complaint, and frowned at the dim room. "Is it morning?" "Nearly," Caroline said. "Will I have to drink broth again?" Julian answered before she could. "Yes." Peter made a face of profound injustice. Caroline almost smiled and felt the motion as a shock in her own cheeks, as if unused muscles had protested the effort. Peter's eyes slid from one adult to the other, then narrowed with a child's blunt perception. "Are you my Lord Duke?" he asked Julian. "I am." "And are you her husband?" The word cut cleanly through the room. Caroline's hand went still over the coverlet. Julian did not blink. "Not yet," he said. Peter considered that. "You look like you are scolding each other anyway." Caroline looked down so the child would not see her expression fracture. Julian's mouth changed by less than a breath, not a smile, a near movement that vanished before it formed. "Drink your water, Mr. Vale," he said. Peter obeyed. When he slept again, the sky outside lifted from charcoal to bruised grey. The first work bells sounded faintly through wet streets. A maid entered with fresh candles and stepped back when she found both chairs still occupied, both figures still wakeful. Her eyes widened at the sight of the Duke's loosened cravat and rolled sleeves, then dropped at once to the carpet. "Leave them," Julian said. She curtsied and retreated. Caroline's exhaustion arrived all at once, not as softness, but as weight. Her spine burned between the shoulder blades. The room tipped slightly when she stood to adjust Peter's blanket. She steadied herself on the bedpost. Julian rose immediately, one hand half extended, then checked the motion before touching her. "Sit," he said. "I am steady. You are not. I have been less steady and remained standing. Sit." The command struck with the same force as on the road, but it carried no public edge now. It carried fear. That recognition moved through her like cold water. She sat because argument required strength she no longer possessed. He remained standing beside her chair for a long moment, as if uncertain what distance to choose. Then he lowered himself back to his own seat and resumed his rigid watch over Peter. But his shoulder had shifted closer to hers than before, close enough that she could feel warmth through wool when she leaned back. Caroline did not mean to lean. She meant to close her eyes for one breath and reopen them. The breath lengthened. Her head tipped. She came back to awareness only when her temple touched solid cloth and the faint scent of rain and starch. She had fallen against his shoulder. She froze. Shame rushed hot through fatigue. She moved to pull away. His voice came low, near her hair. "Do not!" She stayed where she was because the word held no domination and no display. It held something stripped down to necessity. She listened to the nursery clock. Tick, tick, tick. Julian's shoulder did not shift under her weight. His hand remained on the bedrail. Peter slept. Toby snored in small, uneven bursts. Minutes blurred into a kind of suspended stillness. Servants came and went at the door and withdrew without speaking when they saw the arrangement inside. Child sleeping, woman exhausted, Duke motionless as stone. At one point Mrs. Greaves entered with a tray and halted. Her gaze moved from Caroline's sleeping face to Julian's profile. He gave the slightest shake of his head. The housekeeper set the tray down soundlessly and left. Caroline woke later to pale morning fully in the room, and a stiffness in her neck that told her how long she had lain there. Julian had not moved, not by an inch. The line of his jaw had tightened, and his left hand showed a faint tremor where it gripped the rail. But he remained fixed, allowing her borrowed rest without remark. Humiliation dissolved into something fiercer and more dangerous than gratitude. No one had ever held still for her comfort. No one with power had ever chosen inconvenience on her behalf when no audience demanded it. She straightened slowly. "How long?" "Long enough." "That is not an answer." 6 hours, he said. The number settled over her like a verdict. She rose at once, pulling the shawl tighter to mask the trembling she could not quite suppress. Julian stood too, the muscles in his back and shoulders stiff from immobility. He rolled one shoulder once, as if testing damaged ground, then faced her fully. Morning sharpened him. Whatever softness night had permitted was gone from his posture, but not from his eyes. "Come with me," he said. Caroline glanced to Peter. "I will not leave him unattended." "Mrs. Greaves is outside. Dr. Fenwick has sent his morning instructions. The boy is not alone." She hesitated. Julian's gaze flicked to the corridor and back. "Now, Miss Muller." He led her not far, only to the adjoining schoolroom where a fire had been newly laid and legal folios sat stacked on the long table beside a silver coffee service gone cold. Her wedding trunk stood in one corner, mud scraped from its sides, ribbons removed. Someone had cleaned and dried it with care. Beside it lay her soaked mantle, folded. On the table, weighted beneath a paper knife, rested the forged note. Caroline stopped in the doorway. "You brought it here." "I had it examined before dawn." "By whom?" "Klein, my solicitor. A clerk from Chancery who owes me accuracy more than favour. And the messenger you described who was found in Southwark before first light. Her breath caught. Found? Alive, Julian said, reading the fear before it formed. Terrified, bribed and instructed. He has signed a statement. She closed her eyes briefly. By Mrs. Voss. By her steward first, by her own hand in the final instruction. He touched the note with 2 fingers. The handwriting in the body mimics mine. The signature does not. The seal was made from a wax impression taken weeks ago. Caroline thought of open trays in the blue drawing-room, of letters left for dispatch, of how easily a household could be robbed from within when everyone knew where authority slept. She planned this before the wedding. Yes. She expected me to obey. Yes. She expected you to proceed without me and claim insult. A pause. Or to refuse the marriage and leave you publicly disgraced. Either result favoured her. Caroline moved to the table and laid her palm beside the paper knife to steady herself. Wood grain pressed into her skin. She looked up at him. Why? For money first, for control second, for spite throughout. His bluntness would have sounded cruel from another man. From him it sounded like a blade used to cut rot from sound timber. She swallowed. If this reaches magistrates, she will accuse me of invention. She will say I am unstable, ungrateful, vindictive. She has practised those speeches for years. Let her! She will drag my father's debts through every room in London. Julian stepped closer. Then we will drag her ledgers after them. The words struck with force because he did not soften them, did not hide the social war inside polite language. Caroline studied his face and saw no retreat there, only intent. What do you require of me? She asked. The truth, in sequence, nothing omitted. He waited. She gave it. Attic searches after her father's death, missing title packet, hidden copies sewn beneath trunk lining, pantry locks, signatures that altered between draft and fair copy, creditors turned away at side doors, bruises concealed beneath sleeves. She spoke without tremor until she reached the line between humiliation and record, then crossed it anyway because he had asked for sequence, and sequence required detail. He did not interrupt. Once, when her voice roughened, he pushed the coffee cup toward her without comment. She drank because refusal had become pointless. When she finished, he stood very still, both hands braced on the table edge, knuckles pale. You kept evidence. I kept fragments. Where? In the trunk lining. If it has not been searched. His gaze moved to the trunk in the corner and returned. It has not been touched since it entered this house. You are certain? I gave the order myself. Caroline released a breath she had not realized she held. Julian straightened. The morning light hit full across his face and made his eyes look colder like deep water under cloud. His next words came clipped, formal, irrevocable. You will not return to Mrs. Voss. She stared at him. You will remain under my name until this matter is concluded, he said. Not in her house, not in any lodging she can breach. Here, with guard at the doors. The command was protection. The confession sat inside it, stark and unvarnished. Caroline's throat tightened around the answer. That will ruin me in every drawing-room before noon. He did not flinch. You are already being ruined. I will not permit completion. Permit? Yes! She should have recoiled from the word. Instead, she heard the man who had ridden into rain after a coach he believed gone. The man who had held still for 6 hours so she could sleep. The man who had listened to the ugliest facts of her life without looking away. Trust did not arrive as relief. It arrived as terror with a different face. From the nursery came Peter's thin, waking call, followed by Toby's bark. Caroline turned instinctively toward the sound. Julian stepped aside at once, granting her the doorway. "Go," he said. She paused beside him, close enough to see the strain at the corners of his mouth, the fatigue carved beneath his eyes, the fierce control holding everything in place. "Does it hurt," she asked softly, "to protect what you cannot command?" He looked at her, and for the first time since the road he had no immediate answer. She went back to the nursery carrying his silence with her, like a live coal. She carried that silence back into the nursery and found Peter awake, damp curls stuck to his brow, his mother bent over him with both hands around his cup as though warmth could be poured by force. Mrs. Vale looked up when Caroline entered, and gratitude and fear crossed her face in the same instant. "He asked whether he must drink broth again," she whispered. Caroline set the cup steadier in the boy's hand. "He must. 5 spoons by ducal decree." Peter made a wounded sound and drank anyway. Toby thumped his tail once against the blanket. The ordinary stubbornness of a child felt almost sacred after the road. An hour later, when full morning showed the wet streaks on the nursery windows and the bells below stairs marked 8, Mrs. Greaves came with a sealed packet and Klein the solicitor at her shoulder. Klein's spectacles were fogged from rain. He bowed to Caroline with legal haste and laid papers across the schoolroom table where the forged note already waited. "Report from St. Jude's, miss," he said. "The first rider found the chapel in uproar, guests dismissed. No vows attempted. The second rider reached Norhaven House before dawn and secured the East Office. A wax mould of His Grace's seal was recovered from a locked dispatch box in the steward's cabinet." Caroline's fingers tightened on the chair back. "And the messenger?" Klein turned to the doorway. Holden entered with a narrow-shouldered youth whose fair hair was plastered to his skull and whose chin bore a pale, curved scar exactly where she remembered it. The young man kept twisting his cap in both hands. "Name," Klein said. "Thomas Reed, sir." "Did you deliver the note to the chapel carriage on Holborn?" "Yes, sir. From whom were you paid?" Reed swallowed. "Mr. Pritchard, Mrs. Voss's steward, half before, half after." Klein slid a written statement forward, the Southwark deposition already signed before first light. "Read and confirm." Reed read with moving lips, nodded, then set his initials beside the earlier signature in a blotched hand to reaffirm it before witnesses. Caroline watched the ink spread and felt, for the first time since dawn yesterday, the world shift by fact instead of rumour. Mrs. Greaves then brought Caroline's trunk to the centre rug. The false bottom resisted at first. Caroline knelt, found the tiny stitches she had sewn by candle stump, and cut them one by one with Fenwick's discarded lancet. Oilcloth bundles emerged damp but intact. Copied account slips, partial ledgers in her father's hand, the insurance rider, and 3 pages showing withdrawals, signed by Mrs. Voss after his death against accounts she had later sworn were empty. Klein exhaled through his nose. "This is material evidence." "It is my father's life," Caroline said. "It will be both before the magistrate." By noon the rain had lifted to a raw grey brightness, and the hearing room off Chancery Lane stood packed shoulder to shoulder with clerks, creditors, servants on errands, and ladies who had discovered sudden legal curiosity. Julian stood at Caroline's right in dark coat and plain cravat, stripped of ornament, formidable as winter stone. Mrs. Voss arrived in rosewater silk with Eliza and Margot behind her, jewelled, pale, outraged. Heads turned as they swept in. Heads turned harder when Caroline entered on the Duke's arm, wearing the same veil returned in oilcloth from the coaching yard, cleaned and mended by nursery maids before breakfast. Mrs. Voss looked her up and down and smiled with old cruelty. "Still theatrical, Caroline. "You have always preferred spectacle to gratitude," Caroline answered evenly. "I prefer records." The magistrate called order. Testimony came in sequence. The handwriting clerk from Chancery held the forged note beside authenticated letters and pointed out pen pressure, slant variation, and the malformed final stroke in Julian's initial. Reed, shaking, repeated the bribe and identified Pritchard in open court. Holden produced the wax mould from a sealed evidence satchel. Klein entered the trunk documents and the recovered office ledger. Mrs. Greaves testified to chain of custody from dawn search to hearing desk. Then Mrs. Davies was called, older now, shoulders bent, but eyes bright as pins. Caroline had not seen her since the dismissals after her father's funeral. The old housekeeper kept one gloved hand on the rail and spoke without tremor. "I served Mr. Müller 15 years. After his death, Mrs. Voss locked pantry and accounts, struck Miss Caroline in passages, and ordered us to say the girl was forgetful when bruises showed. I refused and was dismissed. 3 nights before the wedding, I returned for my final box. I saw Mr. Pritchard warming sealing wax over the library grate and pressing his Grace's crest from a metal impression. Mrs. Voss rose half out of her chair. "Lies from a discharged servant." The magistrate's gavel cracked once. "Sit down, madam." She sat, silk rustling like anger given fabric. When called, Caroline stood and gave her evidence, in order, no ornament, no plea. Her father's debts, the missing packet, the hidden copies, the chapel dismissal, the coaching yard humiliation witnessed by strangers, the wreck. The note returned to its alleged author in rain. When she finished, the room held a silence so complete she could hear her own pulse in her ears. Mrs. Voss stood for her defence and tried what Caroline knew she would try. "The girl is unstable. She has always embroidered injury. She was fed, clothed, and rescued from spinsterhood by my management. This so-called forgery is a romantic fabrication crafted to trap a nobleman." Julian rose before counsel could answer. His voice carried to the back wall. "Good. I marry her today." The line landed like a struck bell. Eliza gasped. Margot went rigid. Mrs. Voss's composure split at the edges. The magistrate retired only long enough to satisfy procedure. On return, he read findings with clipped finality. Document forgery proven. Financial embezzlement from the Müller estate proven. Attempted coercive dispossession proven. Guardianship rights over Caroline Müller revoked. Mrs. Voss barred from the Müller townhouse and associated accounts pending final civil transfer, effective immediately. Pritchard remanded with her as co-conspirator. Removal ordered under guard. 2 constables stepped forward. Mrs. Voss looked to the room as if rank might still save her. No one moved. As she passed Caroline, she hissed too low for others. "You were nothing before him." Caroline met her gaze. "I was never yours." The guards took Mrs. Voss through the same crowded aisle where she had once displayed Caroline as collateral. This time no one laughed. In the clerk's chamber adjoining court, title instruments were executed at speed under seal. Klein read each line aloud. Caroline signed with a hand that steadied as she wrote. The magistrate's clerk placed 1 iron key on green baize, tagged with the Müller townhouse address. Klein reached to hand it to Caroline, but Julian took it first, closed his fist around it, and gave Klein a look that ended argument. They crossed to street. Jude's in a plain carriage at 3 o'clock. Rain had stopped. The city smelled of wet stone and coal smoke. Inside the chapel, only a narrow congregation remained. Mrs. Greaves, Mrs. Vale with Peter in a clean collar and Toby secretly under the pew. Klein, Holden, Merrick, Dr. Fenwick, and 2 clerks as witnesses. No flowers survived from mourning. Candlelight did enough. At the rail, Caroline's veil trembled at her cheek with each breath. Julian stood beside her, broad-shouldered, motionless, gaze fixed forward as if vows were another form of battle line. The rector began. Words moved around them. Lawful impediment, mutual consent, solemn covenant. Caroline heard them, and heard also the coaching yard laughter, the axle crack, Peter's cry under timber, Julian's single word in the nursery doorway. Before the vows, she turned her face slightly toward him. "Does it hurt to trust what you cannot command?" He did not answer. Instead, he opened his hand and placed the restored townhouse key in her palm, cold iron against her skin, then closed her fingers over it with deliberate care. "I, Julian Ashcombe," he said when the rector prompted, voice roughened and unwavering, "take thee, Caroline Müller, to my wedded wife." She spoke her own vow with the key pressed into her glove and did not falter once. By evening, Norhaven House had changed shape without changing stone. Orders moved from the breakfast room in Caroline's voice and were obeyed without echo. Mrs. Greaves presented household books. Caroline requested wages reviewed for laundry and nursery staff first. Peter, pale but triumphant, delivered Toby to her door with the dignity of an ambassador and announced he had consumed broth without dispute. Julian, hearing this, said only, "I will verify." In her new chamber, Caroline opened her trunk herself. She laid the prayer book on the mantel. She set the 8 hidden pence from her hem in a porcelain dish, not because she needed to hide them now, but because she wanted to remember precisely what survival had cost. She placed the forged note, now marked as court exhibit and returned by Klein, into a locked dispatch box under her own key. Evidence accounted for, past named, no longer governing in shadow. When she turned, Julian stood in the doorway, not entering until she nodded once. He looked at the prayer book, the dish of coins, the legal packet, and finally at her face. "Mrs. Ashcombe," he said, as if testing whether the title fit truth. "It does not erase Müller," she replied. "No!" His mouth shifted, almost that vanished near smile. "Keep both." He stepped in then and shut the door softly behind him, not as a prisoner's bolt, but as shelter chosen together.